Imagine the darkest night in history. The silence weighs heavily in the air as a man, sweating drops of blood, kneels among the olive trees of an ancestral garden. His friends sleep just a few meters away, unaware that, in moments, Roman soldiers will appear with torches and spears to arrest him. But this is not just a moment of betrayal or capture, it is the beginning of a journey that would change the world forever. What would have happened if Pontius Pilate had made a different decision? How did a simple trial in a remote province of the Roman Empire trigger an event that would span centuries, shaping entire civilizations? And, above all, why did such a powerful empire, seemingly unshakable, find itself compelled to yield to the message of the one condemned to death? In this story, we will delve into the conflict between Rome and Jesus of Nazareth, from his arrest in the Garden of Olives to the impact of his crucifixion on the very empire that sought to silence him. Prepare to discover how Roman brutality and Christian faith clashed, resulting in a transformation that no one could foresee. The night was heavy. The air felt charged, as if time itself was about to split in two. After the Last Supper, Jesus led his disciples out of Jerusalem, traversing the narrow, silent streets of the city to the foot of the Mount of Olives. They walked at a slow pace, and the tension was palpable in the group. The destination was the Garden of Gethsemane, a place Jesus knew well. He often went there to meditate and pray, a refuge away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The garden was surrounded by ancient olive trees, their shadows casting distorted silhouettes under the dim light of the moon. The smell of the earth mingled with the aroma of the leaves, and the wind blew gently, swaying the branches as if whispering secrets of the night. But that night, something was different. There was a restlessness in Jesus' eyes. His disciples, exhausted from dinner and long conversations about the uncertain future, followed him in silence. They had shared bread and wine, heard mysterious words about betrayal and suffering, but could not fully grasp the weight of the moment. When they arrived at the garden, Jesus stopped and looked at each of them. His voice, always calm, now carried a more serious tone. "Sit here while I go over there to pray." The disciples obeyed, sinking among the roots of the olive trees, feeling fatigue take hold of them. Peter, James, and John, the closest, were taken by Jesus a little further ahead. There was a shadow of concern on their faces. They often saw their master in prayer, but they had never seen him like this. Jesus stopped, took a deep breath, and looked up at the dark sky. The weight of what was about to happen fell upon him like a crushing rock. He knew his time had come. Turning to the three disciples, he murmured, almost in a whisper, "My soul is deeply troubled, even to death. Stay here and watch with me." Peter tried to respond, but words failed him. James and John merely nodded, feeling an anguish they could not explain. They had seen Jesus calm storms, heal the sick, and cast out demons. But now, before them, was a man carrying an invisible burden, a pain that no one else could bear. Jesus stepped away a few more paces, and finally fell to his knees. The cold ground of Gethsemane embraced his body as his hands clenched tightly in the damp earth. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Fear, pain, and loneliness surrounded him. He was facing the most difficult moment of his life. In the silence of the night, only one plea echoed among the trees: "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. But not as I will, but as you will." The darkness of Gethsemane witnessed a man struggle against his fate. But on the horizon, the flames of torches were already visible, approaching. The traitor was on his way. And with him, the Roman Empire. A pale moon hung high in the sky, casting a faint glow over the Garden of Gethsemane. The silence of the night was interrupted only by the whispering of the wind through the olive leaves and the muffled sound of Jesus' breathing. He had moved away from the disciples, who, despite being warned to stay awake, were beginning to succumb to fatigue. They did not comprehend the weight of that moment. But Jesus did. Alone, he fell to his knees on the cold, damp ground. His body trembled, not from the chill of the night, but from the overwhelming anguish that consumed his soul. The weight of destiny loomed over him like a dense shadow, an impossible burden to bear. He knew what was to come. He took a deep breath and lifted his eyes to heaven, whispering amidst the pain, "Father, if possible, let this cup pass from me." His voice broke at the end of the phrase. The plea was not a request for escape, but a genuine expression of his humanity. He knew he would face pain, humiliation, and death. But above all, he knew he would bear the weight of humanity's sins. Sweat began to trickle down his face, mingling with the silent tears that fell. His heart raced, and his breathing became increasingly difficult. He pressed his hands against the ground, fingers digging into the earth, as if seeking an anchor for his distress. "Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done." These were words of surrender. The internal struggle was immense, but he chose to submit to the Father's plan. The tension in his body was so extreme that something rare began to happen. From his skin, not only sweat flowed, but drops of blood. The anguish was so profound that the capillaries beneath his skin began to rupture. It was a phenomenon known as hematidrosis, something rare, but recorded in situations of extreme fear and unbearable stress. Jesus' body reacted to the overwhelming weight of the responsibility he bore. No human being had ever experienced anything like it. And yet, he remained there, praying, suffering, surrendering. After a while, staggering, he rose and returned to where Peter, James, and John were. But, to his sorrow, he found them sleeping. His closest friends, those who vowed to follow him to the end, had succumbed to fatigue. "Could you not watch with me for 1 hour?" His voice carried pain, but also understanding. The disciples awoke startled, rubbing their eyes, not fully grasping what was happening. The weight of the night still enveloped them. Jesus sighed and moved away again to pray once more. The same plea echoed in the silence, "Father, if it is not possible for this cup to pass without my drinking it, may your will be done." The fear was still there, but now something within him was strengthening. He knew the end was near. Upon returning again, he found the disciples asleep once more. They could not bear the tension of that moment. Jesus did not wake them this time. He simply stood there for a moment, watching them. They did not know what awaited them in the coming hours. Jesus closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and returned for the third and final prayer. It was the moment to fully accept the path that lay before him. His destiny was sealed. In the distance, the silence was broken by the sound of hurried footsteps and the glow of torches cutting through the darkness. The garden, once tranquil, began to be filled with moving shadows. Time had run out. Jesus opened his eyes. They had arrived. The night enveloped the Garden of Gethsemane in a heavy silence, broken only by the murmuring of Jesus' prayer. His body was consumed by anguish. The weight of his mission was not only spiritual, but also physical. As he cried out to the Father, something rare and astonishing began to happen. His sweat mixed with blood, running down his face and dripping onto the cold ground. What Jesus was experiencing was a real, rare phenomenon documented in medicine, hematidrosis. This condition occurs when a person undergoes extreme psychological stress. The nervous system, in a state of maximum alert, releases a wave of stress hormones that directly affect the capillaries supplying the sweat glands. What happens then is that these capillaries rupture due to intense pressure, mixing blood with sweat. The reddish drops that flowed down Jesus' face were a physical manifestation of the torment he was enduring internally. His body was reacting to the weight of the decision he had just made. In medicine, reports of hematidrosis are rare, but they have been observed in soldiers before battles, prisoners condemned to death, and even in people subjected to severe psychological torture. However, none of these experiences compare to the suffering that Jesus bore. It was not just fear of physical pain. He was facing something much greater, the burden of the sin of all humanity. This phenomenon, besides its physical impact, carries a profound symbolism. Jesus' sweat of blood represents the apex of his emotional and spiritual suffering. There, in Gethsemane, he felt the weight of every mistake, every pain, every injustice committed by humanity. The blood that began to be shed there was the first sign of the sacrifice that would be consummated a few hours later. Even before the Romans whipped him and before the nails pierced his hands and feet, Jesus' body was already showing signs of the intensity of his surrender. In the Old Testament, sweat was associated with human effort. In the book of Genesis, after Adam's sin, God said, "In the sweat of your face you shall eat bread, till you return to the ground." Genesis 3 verse 19. Now, in Gethsemane, Jesus was sweating not just ordinary sweat, but blood, symbolizing that he was taking upon himself the curse of humanity. The suffering that began there was not just physical, but an anguish that no other person would be able to bear. The drops of blood fell to the ground, soaking the soil. The same ground that supported the feet of his disciples now received the first shedding of the blood of the one who was about to be delivered. It was a prelude to what was to come. The decision was made. Jesus opened his eyes. He would not flee. He would not try to escape. His destiny was sealed. And, in the distance, amidst the darkness of the garden, the lights of the torches began to appear. Betrayal was on its way. The Garden of Gethsemane remained shrouded in twilight, with only the moon and stars casting a faint light over the olive trees. The air was cool yet heavy with tension. Jesus, kneeling a few meters away from his disciples, was engulfed in deep agony, sweating blood as he cried out to the Father. But the disciples slept. Peter, James, and John were nearby, but their heads felt heavy, their eyes closing against their will. The dinner, the wine of the Last Supper, and the emotional strain of the past days contributed to their inevitable sleep. They had been warned by Jesus to watch and pray, but they succumbed to fatigue. After his first anguished prayer, Jesus rose, his face still marked by the sweat of blood. He walked over to where the disciples were and, to his sorrow, found them sleeping. "Simon, are you sleeping?" he asked Peter, his voice laden with sorrow. "Could you not watch for 1 hour?" Peter awoke, still confused, blinking repeatedly to shake off the drowsiness. James and John were also trying to compose themselves. "Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak." Those words carried a weight greater than they understood at the moment. Danger was near. The greatest spiritual battle in history was being fought. They could not stay awake. Jesus sighed deeply. He understood human weakness, but the loneliness of the moment began to intensify. His closest friends could not support him in this hour of agony. Jesus returned to his place of prayer. His soul was even more distressed, and he again poured out his supplications to the Father. "My Father, if it is not possible for this cup to be taken away unless I drink it, may your will be done." The silence of the garden was broken only by his breathing. Time seemed to drag slowly as he completely surrendered his life to the divine purpose. Then, rising once more, Jesus returned to the disciples. And once again, they were sleeping. This time, he did not even try to wake them. His eyes rested on those 3 men who had promised to follow him to the end, but who were now defenseless against their own fatigue. The image was painful, they wanted to stay awake, but were unable. This moment demonstrated humanity's weakness. Jesus' loneliness became even more evident. He was facing the greatest decision in history, and there was no one to support him. For the 3rd time, Jesus withdrew and prayed. His heart was already set. He had fully accepted the cross that awaited him. When he returned again, he found the disciples asleep once more. Now, they were sleeping deeply, oblivious to the critical moment unfolding around them. Jesus looked at them with compassion. They were ordinary men, fragile, made of flesh and bone. Then, for the last time, he woke them. But this time, his words were different. Are you still sleeping and resting? The hour has come. The Son of Man is being delivered into the hands of sinners. He lifted his gaze, and in the distance, torches were approaching. The sound of footsteps on the ground echoed among the trees. Betrayal was underway. The dark tranquility of the Garden of Gethsemane was shattered by a growing noise of footsteps and murmurs. The flickering glow of torches cut through the darkness, revealing an armed group approaching rapidly. At the front of the troop, a familiar figure led the group, Judas Iscariot. The disciples awoke dazed, their eyes still heavy with sleep. When they realized what was happening, panic took hold of them. Temple soldiers, Pharisees, and Roman guards were arriving, armed with swords and spears. Peter's heart raced. He exchanged quick glances with the other disciples. Why was Judas there? Why was he leading those men? But Jesus, with a serene gaze, remained steadfast. He already knew. Judas walked hurriedly, his steps firm, but his face was laden with tension. He was about to consummate the act that would mark him forever. The metallic sound of swords being drawn echoed through the garden. The soldiers were ready to act at any sign of resistance. But what would break the silence of the moment would not be a scream, nor a military order. It would be a kiss. Judas approached Jesus and, without hesitation, fulfilled the agreement with the priests. He kissed him on the cheek. Jesus looked directly into the eyes of his disciple. His voice was calm, but laden with meaning. Judas, with a kiss do you betray the Son of Man? Judas did not respond. His eyes fled from Jesus' gaze. It was too late for regrets. The soldiers, seeing the agreed signal, advanced. They moved like predators ready to capture their prey. Peter, filled with rage, drew his sword and charged at one of the men. The gleam of the blade sliced through the air and struck Malchus, the servant of the high priest, severing his ear. Malchus fell to the ground, holding the side of his face, his scream of pain echoing through the garden. Chaos ensued. But then Jesus raised his hand. Stop! His voice rang out strong, cutting through the tension. He looked at Peter and said, "Put your sword away. For all who take the sword will perish by the sword." Peter, panting, hesitated. His instinct was to fight, but Jesus' command was clear. Then, in an unexpected and shocking gesture to the soldiers, Jesus approached Malchus. Even being his enemy, even about to be taken as a prisoner, he touched the man's wound. And at the moment his hand touched the blooded skin, Malchus's ear was restored. The guards exchanged looks of disbelief. What kind of man was this? But there was no time for reflection. They had a mission to fulfill. Jesus turned to the soldiers and said, "You have come to arrest me with swords and clubs, as if I were a bandit. Every day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not arrest me. But this is your hour, and the power of darkness." The soldiers hesitated for a moment, as if they could not believe he would not offer resistance. But then, they bound his hands, and took him as a prisoner. The disciples, filled with fear, fled. The betrayal was complete. The lamb was delivered to the wolves. Jesus was betrayed with a kiss, arrested without resistance, and abandoned by his own disciples. But that was just the beginning. What will happen now that he is in the hands of the religious leaders and the powerful Roman Empire? How will Pontius Pilate react to the accusations? And what will be Judas's fate after his betrayal? In the next video, you will witness the interrogations, the humiliations, and the twists that will lead Jesus to the most unjust trial in history. The story is not over yet. Click on the next video and discover what happens after the betrayal in Gethsemane.